So this is the weekly review, making sense of relevant topics and news. It's a program of Sawa Sawa Network, and I'm Roger Alfred Yoron Modi, the producer and host. Joining the program today is Dr. Peter Biar, a South Sudanese civil society leader. He is also a Reagan Fassel, a Democracy Fellow, National Endowment for Democracy. We will be discussing his last week's testimony before the U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, as well as his views on current affairs in South Sudan. Welcome to the weekly review, Dr. Peter Biar.
Thank you, Roger Modi, for inviting me. It's a pleasure for me to be here.
For the benefit of my audience, just give a brief summary of your testimony, your last week's testimony before the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations.
All right. So basically what I try to outline in my testimony, I was invited to talk about the challenge to democracy around the world. And I chose to focus primarily on South Sudan and also the Horn of Africa and the continent of Africa. In regard to South Sudan, what was important for me was to start first by providing thanks to so many members of the committee who were quite vocal during my incarceration. When I was arrested, there were a number of committee members who wrote letters and who also tweeted about my case. So that was the first order of business for me, was to give them thanks. Second was to give them a sense of how things are in South Sudan. The country is currently doing terrible in every measure. The poverty rate, as I mentioned, has increased from 50% in 2011 to 80%, actually 82% as we speak. Last year, we were ranked dead last on the Social Progress Index of 2020. We tied with Somalia on the Corruption Perception Index. And for the Freedom House score, we rank only 2 out of 100 for the 2021, which is actually an improvement, because what people don't realize is in the 2020 index, we rank actually -2. And the index is supposed to rank between 0 and 100. And we were not even within the metrics. We were -2. And the third is to let the world know that we have a government in Juba that has never been elected, and the government that has done everything within its power to avoid elections and to avoid giving the people of South Sudan the constitutional right to choose their leaders, and sharing some ideas on how the world can help South Sudan to finally have elections. Finally, it was also highlighting the issues of human rights violation, which are all over the place in the country, and they are particularly perpetrated by the National Security Service, run by General Akol Kurukuch, who personally oversees the planning and the commission of these human rights violations. So I asked the United States government to sanction General Kuch and some of his top cronies who are personally overseeing this commission of gross human rights violations.
Talking about elections, you emphasized that the elections be done next year, and you also went further to talk about the risk of sham elections, as happening in some other African countries. Do you see the link between the two? Because rushing for elections also could possibly lead us to sham elections. So in terms of preparing the country, in terms of implementing some of the parts of the agreement that require for reforms in institutions that can prepare the country for democratic elections, how do you see the two? Because with rushing for elections, there is possibility of having it as a sham election.
That is a very good question, and that is a legitimate question, Roger. There are never perfect elections in the world, and even here in the United States, as you have seen last year, you can never really have elections that are absolutely perfect. What you try to do is to have elections that reflect the will of the people. And in my testimony, I outlined some of the things that I mentioned in the peace agreement that are supposed to be done before the elections are held. One of these is, of course, the merger of the different forces, different militias in the country that are currently fighting one another. It's important that these forces are unified and they are brought together into a national army. That is the first order of business. The second issue, of course, is the promulgation of the new constitution. What we have now in South Sudan is a transitional constitution And there's a need really for a constitution that reflects the will of the people of South Sudan. So I outline that process. The third is the conduct of census. And this is specifically mentioned because the last census that was conducted in South Sudan was when we were still part of Sudan in 2008. And there is really a need to assess the population growth, the demarcation of constituencies, and of course, the updating of the voter registry so that we know the qualified number of voters in the country. All of these things are supposed to be done. And the problem is we have a political class in the country that lack the will to actually do that and who intentionally sabotage the implementation of the peace agreement so that elections are never held and so that people of South Sudan do not have any mechanism for holding them accountable. So this put us in a very difficult choice because if we continue to believe that these people need time and that the country is not ready, then we will be unready forever. And they will continue to push these elections and avoid accountability for so long as they can manage. And that is an unattainable situation. So what we want is the peace agreement has a timeline. And this timeline, the agreement is mentioned specifically that it ends by the 12th of May, 2022. And the agreement requires that the election be held at least 60 days before the end of the transitional government. So that is the timeline we are working with. And if the timeline finish and all of these momentous tasks are not accomplished, then what will that makes clear to the international community is that Kiir and Riek Machar do not have the political will to implement the agreement fully in a way that can allow the people of South Sudan to hold elections on time. And instead of the election being postponed again, and as you know, they have been postponed so many times, from 2015 to 2018, then 2018 to 2021, and then when this peace agreement was signed, they were postponed again to 2022. So if they are postponed again further, what that will show is that these leaders lack the will to make the kind of decisions that are required for election to be held. And therefore, if continuing to give them more time will not actually allow South Sudan to hold elections. It will only allow these leaders to continue to loot the country, to destroy the aspiration and the hopes of the people of South Sudan. And that requires hard decisions to be made. And I mentioned specifically the example of the case of Liberia, when it was clear that Charles Taylor was not interested in allowing the country to move forward toward a democratic transition. The African Union and the United Nations made a tough decision. And Charles Taylor was removed from his position, and a new transitional government was put in place that has the political will to prepare the country for the kind of elections that we are talking about. So the choice really is with those of Salva Kiir and Riek Machar. Do they have the political will to make the tough decisions that are required for election to happen next year? And if they don't have the will to do that, then what will become clear is that they can never really be entrusted with such a responsibility, and they have no ability to implement it. And that will require a serious look at the Liberian model.
Political will from Dr. Riek Machar and President Kiir. Now, you also talk about unification of forces and some of the reforms, including the census preparations and voter registry and all this. You know, once we look critically into why the 2015 peace agreement was not implemented fully, and even the forces that were to be unified by then, including the ones that joined Kiir, those of Taban and so on, were not, there was no evidence that they were clearly unified. And now we have the agreement going, and also the forces under the signatories to the agreement are not unified, and the unification is taking long. Yet there are new rebel groups that operate at the moment, coming even recently, the new that have declared themselves. In terms of political will that you are asking from those leaders who are part of the agreement, what is your view with regards to those who are outside the agreement and their impact in the elections that you are calling for? Do you think it is going to be possible with some rebel groups outside and causing probably insecurity also for that elections?
Well, the task of implementation of the agreement is with those that have signed the agreement. And the problem is those who have signed the agreement have shown that they don't have the political will to implement the agreement. And therefore, those who are outside the country, those who have not signed the agreement, they wonder what is the point of joining an agreement that is not being implemented. It would just basically bring them to Juba, and things will continue as they were continuing before. So this is really the paradox. So the issue is, if the leaders in Juba had the will, the agreement was signed in 2018. We are in 2021. That is 3 years ago. So if these people had the will, then some of these things we are talking about, like the unification of the forces, these were actually supposed to be implemented fully within the pre-transitional period. And they didn't even begin to look at them, even as we speak. Madam Magdalena made it clear last week, the Minister of Defense, that the forces that were at the cantonment site have deserted. So they have deserted. No one knows where they have gone or how to bring them back. And I read that earlier this week, the president was asking for a report on what is happening with that. For this whole time, he has not been asking for a report. So finally, he's asking for a report about what is happening there. All of this is going to show that the leaders lack the political will. And this is actually the importance of making sure that these elections happen on time. And this is why it's important for the people of South Sudan to push these leaders to make sure elections happen on time, because we are tired of them. And they are imposing themselves on us. And they are not making the kind of decision that can allow the country to move seamlessly toward the conduct of the election. So they have to be given a choice. Either they make the kind of decision that are needed for election to happen on time, or when they fail to hold election on time, then their government, which is already illegitimate, will have expired. And therefore, they will have no foundation whatsoever to continue to rule South Sudan. So then the international community will look at this. And I'm actually very glad that the UN Security Council unanimously renewed the mandate of UNMISS and added in a new language, requiring that the Secretary General report by 15th of July this year on the kind of conducive environment for election. So when this report comes and the report concludes that there is no conducive environment for election to be held, and that these leaders are not making the kind of decision that need to be made to allow election to happen by next year, then what that will mean to the Security Council is that Salva Kiir and Riek Machar do not have the ability, they do not have the will to allow the people of South Sudan to hold election. And therefore, there will be a need to consider other modalities, because people of South Sudan cannot be held hostage by individuals who are power hungry and who are looting the resources, basically making people of South Sudan poor and suffer when they are blessed with a land that is very fertile and very rich. So the Security Council will look at this. And this is one of the things that have happened, and we are very happy that it has happened.
So you believe that President Kiir and Dr. Riek, if they have the political will and the parties to the agreement have the political will to do elections, they should do elections, despite that some groups may be outside, those who have not signed the agreement, fighting the government, or you believe they might be included through many other processes, maybe before the elections next year, in just two scenarios?
Well, I think, if you remember, Mr. Roger, when we had the referendum in 2011, not all the Junubin were in the government. Not all the rebels group had put down the arms. David Yao Yao was still in the bush, and he was fighting the government. George Athor was in the bush fighting the government. Those of Nguyen Mointwil, Baping, those of Baping Mointwil, not Nguyen, but Baping Mointwil, were fighting the government. And there were a number of other different rebel groups that were in the bush, and they were fighting the government. This did not prevent the government from conducting the referendum. The referendum were conducted. I think there is an understanding that can be reached with these groups, and already many of them have signed a cessation of hostilities agreement with the government. So the election can theoretically happen. And yes, 12 months is a very long time to hold elections. I remember very well when the referendum was held, it took a while, really, until around September 2010 for a political will that was needed to happen that allowed the referendum to be conducted on time. And that was just only a matter of 4 months. And with the political will, the resources were made available, and the referendum happened on time. The same thing if you look at the Nigerian transition in 1990s. The transition that allowed the election of President Obasanjo to happen, it was only an 11-month transition. And the leadership was quite keen that the election must take place on time. And just within 11 months, they were able to hold elections on time. And this was a country that was very divided, that was had a lot of challenges, security challenges, economic challenges, but because they had the political will, the election happened. So the choice, again, as I mentioned, is with Salva Kiir and Riek Machar. They can hold these elections if they have the political will. They can do the kind of things that can give people confidence so that the election happen on time. But if they don't show the political will, well, South Sudan is not theirs alone. And the people of South Sudan and the rest of the world made a lot of sacrifices for South Sudan to be an independent state. And they're not going to allow two individuals to hold the country hostage. So if the Secretary General report to the Security Council by 15th of July that there is no political will, that there is no progress in the security sector, and that the climate and the environment is not conducive for election because the two leaders and the partners in peace are not making the tough decision for election to be held, well, then the Security Council now will consider other ideas. And Security Council has a responsibility to ensure peace and security in the world. And we have here a government that was never elected by the people of South Sudan that is preventing the election to happen. That is something that needs to be considered.
And with regards to the legal and institutional reforms that are provided for in the agreement to make the country and to make our institutions and laws democratic, including the permanent constitution making process, what do you say? Because even the agreement prescribes a system of governance. It says federalism is a popular demand of the people of South Sudan, and one of the parameters of the constitution stipulated in the agreement is the enactment of federal democratic constitution. What do you say about the system of governance?
No, absolutely. There is no doubt that federalism is a desire and a demand of our people. If you look at the history of our country from the 1950s when Sudan got independence, one of the things that South Sudanese demanded from the very beginning was that there should be a federal arrangement in the country. So there is a long history. In fact, one of the first political parties that the South Sudanese formed was a federal party to push for the issue of federalism. So this is a popular desire. And of course, South Sudanese don't want to live in a country that is corrupt. They're ranked last in the corruption perception index, and it's tied with Somalia in terms of corruption. We want a country that is prosperous, and our people are very honest people, and therefore that honesty should be reflected in the institutions that govern them. But the problem is we have a regime in Juba that is not interested in any reform whatsoever. And what it is doing is to throttle the environmental reform and to prevent reforms from happening. And we have seen this clearly in the security sector. We have seen it in the financial sector with the ways in which the resources are being spent. We have seen this also in the governance. We have seen this in the central bank. We have seen this in the oil industry and how the oil is essentially being looted by a small clique of people. So the problem here is you have an agreement that calls for reform, but you have a government that is not interested in reform. And because it's only interested in lengthening its survival, is basically dragging its feet so that people can argue that you need first reform before you do election. Well, my point of view is you have a regime that has no interest for reform. And therefore, the only thing that we can demand of them is do elections. Do the basic necessity that is required for this election to be held. That is really the last chance. And I think this is really an opportunity for Kiir and Machar to demonstrate to the world that they are serious. Because when they become clear that these people are not serious, they are not holding elections, they are not making the right kind of decision for election to take place, and they were never elected, these are people that are essentially imposing themselves. Kiir was appointed as president by parliament, and that is why he was sworn in again on July 9th. So he's not really a legitimately elected president. And the only reason why he was appointed was so that he can organize election, which he has failed to do since 2011. And now we are in 2021. It's a decade later on, and he's still not able to hold elections. Well, if the Security Council see that the problem is there is no conducive environment on the ground, and the reason why there is no conducive environment on the ground is because these leaders don't have the political will to make the kind of decision that is required, and then the Security Council see the genuine demand of the people of South Sudan for election, well, then The compromise may very well become that a new transitional mechanism is put in place in Juba that does not include Kiir and Machar, and that, by the way, will be in conformity with international law because he was never elected by the people of South Sudan. So he can just be removed just the same way he was appointed. And another person can be appointed and tasked with finally creating the kind of environment to hold election. Otherwise, he has to make the right decision right now. And he has to provide the political will so that he hold elections on time. That is it.
There were a lot of controversies and complaints on social media on the use of the term appointed. People were saying Kiir was not appointed, he was elected. While indeed the 2010 elections was for Southern Sudan, not for the independent South Sudan, and his extension of term came through the parliament when the parliament amended the constitution in 2011 to have him continue as the president of South Sudan, and that is a fact. What would be a response to those people complaining about the use of the term appointed?
You know, the problem is people, they don't like something that makes them uncomfortable. And sometimes truth is uncomfortable. And that is the reality of it. It's not something that you and I can invent. It's the truth. And that is the way it is. When the 2010 election happened, I remember very well because the position for which Salva Kiir contested was the position of the president of the government of Southern Sudan. And that has a specific legal definition per the Sudan constitutions of 2005 and also per the interim constitution of Southern Sudan of 2005. This was never a sovereign country with the sovereign responsibilities. Kiir now is a president under the transitional constitution of South Sudan. And that transitional constitution was endorsed on the 8th of July, 2011. And I remember very well when that was endorsed because I was intimately involved in the process of it since the World Bank, at the time when I was a World Bank economist, we were supporting the South Sudan transition to independent state. A compromise was made. In fact, there was a lot of MPs that were demanding that instead of giving him until 2015, we should just hold elections in 2012 because we are a new country and we need elections and there need to be a new mandate. But then people argue that we need to give ourselves time so that we build the credible institutions and consolidate peace and provide services for our people so that we hold elections in an environment that is favorable to a democratic transition. So yes, he was appointed. And this is why, in the Constitution, it was put in there that the current president or the incumbent president of the government will continue as the president until 2015. This was an appointment. It was a decision that the parliament made and that was endorsed by the parliament. And that is why on the July 9th, he had to be sworn in again. He had to take an oath of office. So if he was already an elected president, why did he need to be sworn in? He had to be sworn in. And that is the reality of it. So people are uncomfortable hearing the truth. But truth is something that is there in your face. It's not something that people invent. It's the reality of the situation. And what he was supposed to do then was to hold elections in 2015. But he was already afraid of elections in 2015. And that is why in 2013, when the war broke out, if you look really what was the context of the issues that led to the war, there were three issues. And they related to how elections within the SPLM will be conducted. One was the voting mechanism within the SPLM. How would the delegates that are supposed to elect the chairman and the other official of the SPLM supposed to vote? And in the SPLM constitution, it has always been that people will vote through a secret ballot. Even when the referendum was held, it was under secret ballot. Even when the 2010 election were held, it was under the secret ballot. But now the president all of a sudden wanted people to vote through the show of hand because he wanted Mr. Kolokur and his agents to be sitting there and look at who did not vote for him. The second issue was an issue of the appointment of delegates. Everywhere in the world, any party or any entity that adheres to democratic norms, all the delegates are elected by the people that appoint them or that nominate them to come and represent them at whatever level. But he wanted to appoint a certain percentage of the delegates, because he was afraid that he was already becoming very unpopular within the SPLM. And if the people actually voted all the delegates, then maybe he will not be elected. And the third issue was that he wanted the chairman to then appoint the other official within the SPLM, the deputy chairman, the secretary general, who are also supposed to be elected. Forgetting himself when he was a deputy to John Garang when in 1994 convention, he was elected. He was not appointed by Garang, he was elected. But all of a sudden now he wanted to be the one to appoint people. So that already showed that he didn't have interest to hold election.
Let's talk about corruption. You mentioned earlier also. Corruption is a huge issue in South Sudan, actually for years now. And looking at our laws, for example, even the constitution itself, right now even it's not being followed for like the anti-corruption, which is supposed to be fighting corruption as per the constitution. And the president is supposed to appoint, and you have the chairperson and all this supposed to be going through the parliament for approval and all this, but for the past few years of the way especially, this has not been happening. And our laws also, the constitution was having some loopholes whereby you find the investigation to the Anti-Corruption Commission was to go through the Ministry of Justice, which itself is the executive. And so you can see conflict of interest here and all those loopholes. How can corruption really be fought in South Sudan in your view? Because it has been affecting so many things in the country for so many years.
You know, you articulated very well some of the contradictions within the legal architecture of the country, and that is very clear. That need to be fixed. You know, anti-corruption commission need to have prosecutorial powers. It has to have the ability to prosecute people without necessarily having to go to the Ministry of Justice, you know, because that then politicizes the whole thing. But the real issue in South Sudan is you have a leadership that is actively promoting corruption. You have a president who is corrupt, and you have his family, which is quite corrupt. And therefore, because he's the one that appoints people, there is completely no way in which corruption can be genuinely fought in the country. So even if the legal instruments were there, given that all the powers now are concentrated in the hands of the president, it would be very challenging for any official to attempt to fight corruption and still survive in such a system. The first thing he would do would be to remove them. So for us to begin to even fight corruption, it requires us to move to a new political paradigm in which we have a genuine leadership that is interested in the will of the people of South Sudan, that is going to prioritize the interests of the people of South Sudan, and that is going to set a completely new direction for the country. That is where now fighting corruption will become a real thing. But now it's just a lip service. It's being done simply to pretend that we are fighting corruption when corruption is the system. If you look at the wages that are being paid in the country, you know, if you look at some of the officials, even like a major general in the army, the salary is something around like 8,000 South Sudanese pounds. 8,000 South Sudanese pounds is about, you know, $12. How do you expect a major general to live on a $12 salary? And then this salary doesn't come on time. Sometimes it goes for 7 months, 8 months, it doesn't come. Like the diplomats now, they have not been paid for 2 years. So then how do you expect these people to survive? It means, of course, people are going to be doing corruption. So in a sense, the system you have in South Sudan runs because of corruption. People are surviving because of corruption. And that is a deliberate decision so that then no one is able to fight corruption.
Then how are we going to get this country out of that? Because even those people with corrupt money, and you also mentioned about issue of human rights violations and all this. So you find don't you think there's a connection between the two? Because the people who have money, or the people who engage in human rights abuses and all those, they become powerful also through the corrupt ways. And now how do you get them out of those apps, and they're powerful in the country?
Yes, the two are connected. Definitely, they are absolutely connected. And even corruption should be seen as a human rights violation as well. Because if you see now what is happening in Upper Nile and Unity State, the two oil-producing states in South Sudan, the environment is being polluted. Children are being born with deformities. Cattle are dying in large numbers. People are dying. Water is being polluted. Land is being polluted. Yet the proceeds from the oil are being corrupted by a few individuals. So this is a serious violation. And these individuals have only militarized the society using guns to intimidate people and to prevent people from speaking out. And this is why I said the only way we can really begin to address the challenges that we face as a society is by first having a new political paradigm that does not include Salva Kiir and Riek Machar. That is the only way forward. And we want to do it democratically, because when I was detained, I was accused with all these made up charges of treason, creating insurgency, terrorism, and all these other things that they look up in the dictionary, and that have no relevance to what we are talking about. But what we are talking about is we won elections, because we know very well if there are elections, we wonder what Salva Kiir will come and tell us. Like, what is he going to tell us that he will do? Or how is he going to even justify the way in which he has spent the last 15 years in power? We want to hear that. But the thing is, if he doesn't hold election, he has to know that there are other ways, that he cannot basically impose himself forever. And the fact that he was never elected by our people, that is wonderful, because he's illegitimate president. And if he is a legitimate president, the only reason why he's there is because of the international recognition. And that recognition can be withdrawn if he does not hold elections. So he has to hold elections. And if he does not hold elections, the people of South Sudan are going to show it to the world that they have a legitimate government, they have a legitimate president, they have this nonsense of 5 vice presidents, none of whom was ever elected by the people of South Sudan, all of whom there doing what? Warlords, essentially, imposing themselves on the people of South Sudan. So we are going to ask the Security Council, if the report does come back in July, that the environment is not being created and that there is no conducive environment in the country for election to be held, then yes, we are going to begin to propose some of the options on how we can use the Liberian model of Charles Taylor and get rid of this regime.
The situation in South Sudanese circumstances, starting, for example, let's say from 2005 with the signing of the peace agreement with the CPA, when that order was created and the semi-autonomous government was put in place, moving forward up to elections, yes, and then referendum and independence. And before that, even the feeling of South Sudanese and the understanding of being a South Sudanese among the people, there used to be a lot of variations, and even up to now, the people don't really get along so easily because of long history of conflicts and communal violence. People don't get along, people don't understand themselves, and looking at the history of also human rights violations that happened before, even the last 2 wars of 1955 to 72, and then later to the 1983 and 2005. The situation has been complex and difficult. Do you think, and I'm not trying to be a defender or an advocate for the president or Machar, but limiting the problem of South Sudan or blaming it on Kiir and Machar is not being unfair? Don't you think it's not being unfair to the two?
There's no denying that we have a long history of conflict and we have a long history of trauma. That is true. But I also know in 2005, when the peace agreement was signed, there was a lot of hope. People of South Sudan gave Salva Kiir and the SPLM an opportunity to deliver on the promises that they made to the people of South Sudan. From 2005 on, violence really reduced dramatically across the country. You could travel. I remember one time I was driving in 2006 from Naruz to New Site in eastern Equatoria. And on the way, our car broke down. And we had no other option but to walk the rest of the journey, which really took us many hours. But we walked. And on the way, we met with some of the local Taposa, civilians, some of whom were carrying their weapons and they were traveling around. No one attacked us. No one did anything. We moved all the way until we reached the New Site safely. That showed that, the country was safe. You cannot do the same thing now. Nowadays, if you do the same thing, you will most likely be shot by somebody on the way regardless of where in the country that situation occurs. So there was an opportunity that was given to the regime. But instead of building on the aspiration and delivering what the people of South Sudan want, from very early on, Kiir's regime was plagued with corruption and loss of vision and loss of focus on nation and state building. And when it became clear that they were using tribalism and reminding people of the bad experiences of the past, this is why now Junubin were forced to embrace those divisions. If you recall very well, before the war broke out in 2013 at that SPLM meeting, if you remember the speech the president gave, what he did was basically trying to incite the people of South Sudan, particularly the Dinka people against Nuer people, referencing the 1991 and the division that happened in 1991 and the massacres that happened in 1991. What he was doing, he was using the terrible history that South Sudanese were trying to work very hard to overcome and use it to divide people and to strengthen his hand so that he can then create an opposition against Riek Machar and against Nuer people, which then resulted in the massacres of Nuer people in Juba, which was sponsored by the regime, going door to door to kill the people. So of course you have to blame them. You have to blame these two, because then later on, Riek Machar then responded with the massacres of people in Jonglei, in Bor, in Upper Nile, and in Unity State, killing people along ethnic lines. So these individuals, they are very present. Just their presence alone remind people of the terrible dark history of South Sudan. Presence of Riek remind people of 1991. President of Kiir reminds people of the 2013 door-to-door massacres of Nuer. So they should go.
You mentioned human rights violations and also the National Security Service. What role, actually, people are saying you played a role in the development of the National Security Bill by then, which is now said to be a law, it's an act now. And one of the problems with that law is that it has gone past what the Constitution actually envisioned, which was supposed to have a professional National Security Service that is limited to information gathering and analysis and sharing with relevant authorities like the police and so on. So what role exactly did you play in that development of that law?
Yes, that is true, Roger. I was involved as part of the drafting committee of the National Security Bill. And it was not the only thing we were drafting. We were drafting also the white paper on intelligence and national security. I was the secretary of the committee that drafted the national security policy and strategy of South Sudan. The bill we submitted to the leadership of the national security at the time has no resemblance to the current law and the bill that was later on tabled before the parliament. And it's very important for people of South Sudan to understand this. The bill that my committee and I submitted defined the role of the national security only as information gathering institution, as defined by Article 160 of the Transitional National Constitution of South Sudan. The only role, the only mandate should be the collection, analysis, evaluation, and advice to relevant authority based on information. But Mr. Akolikur at the time, working with the president, wanted to create a paramilitary organization that has no oversight. And if you see, the current law is actually very similar to the Sudan National Security Act that the SPLM opposed, that the National Islamic Front and the National Congress Party wanted to pass in 2010. Is entirely different from the bill that we submitted. The bill that we submitted gave no powers to national security to arrest people. In fact, this was part of my debate with Mr. Akolikur at the time. I told him that national security has no business whatsoever arresting people. Those powers are strictly for the police. I also made it clear that national security has no business having tanks, artillery, and all these big weapons. That is the role of the army. And there is no reason for the national security to encroach into the role of the army or the role of the police. This is some of the things that actually created a massive disagreement between him and me, even before I left the government. And the good thing is the former Minister of National Security, General Oyai Dengajak, he stood very strongly with me on this point. And it was one of the reasons that later on in the cabinet massacre of July 2013, that he was fired along with the rest of the cabinet. And in the state, the minister that was brought in place was someone that could not challenge a Kolokur, and someone that allowed a Kolokur to then impose this act in place. This act is unconstitutional. And even the way in which it was endorsed without even the quorum in the parliament. So it's actually an illegal law.
You mentioned about the national dialogue, which actually was instituted by President Kiir, and you cited it, the resolution calling for Kiir and Machar to leave. So what's your view actually on the national dialogue? You tell us.
You know, when the national dialogue started, I was very much against it, because what I saw was Kiir was trying to use it as a way of legitimizing himself and in ways of trying to prevent the implementation of the 2015 agreement, which of course collapsed in 2016. And the fact that, he was the one that appointed the committee, and at the time, many of the people that were on the committee were the members of the Dinka Council of Elders or the Jiang Council of Elders, which was at the time supporting the president. So I was very concerned, I was very skeptical. And I made this very clear to the Jiang Council of Elders when they invited me to speak to them just before I was arrested. I told them that they had no business, trying to pretend as if they are a political party and to write to the UN and to write to the African Union defending the government. That is none of their business, because Dinka as an ethnic group is not a political party, and you have Dinka people that are of diverse political views. But then what happened was, as the things in the country become clear, because when the war broke out, it was not very clear where the problem was. But over time, it became very clear where the problem was. And the problem was that we had a failed leadership, a leadership that did not have a vision. So as this committee went to the grassroots to consult with the people made it very clear that, the problem is in Juba and is at the top with the leadership that has lost vision and has no direction for the country. So these people now, they had no choice but to come back and tell the president that what the people are saying is that you and Riek Machar are actually the problem of South Sudan. And therefore, you need to exit. And if you are not going to exit, you need to organize the election. So this is now the point that every one of us is talking about, that these two individuals, they have imposed themselves on us for so long. And time has come for them to leave. I stand in strong solidarity with Angelo Beda and the rest of the National Dialogue Committee, and ensuring that, and Bona Malwal, by the way, as rapporteur, Francis Mading, all of these people, they are now showing that they are standing in solidarity with the people of South Sudan, rather than a illegitimate regime that was never elected by the people of South Sudan, that is so corrupt, that is involved in human rights violations, and that has made mockery of the genuine struggle of our people.
What if it was just Kiir wants to go, or some people want him to go, but then they want to pull down Dr. Machar with them? Is that fair?
I think you cannot talk about Kiir failure alone. They talk. When people say that one hand cannot clap, so if you try to clap one hand, that does not clap. The two hands that are clapping is Salva Kiir and Riek Machar. They clap together. And these are the people that are responsible for the crisis in which the country is in. They remind people of the terrible history of the past, the bad things that have happened to the people of South Sudan, and therefore, is not something that just people want Kiir to go. They also want Machar to go. This is why you see people always defecting from him. Even people that were supporting him, they're all defecting from him. He has shown that he is no different to Salva Kiir. Is an element of division, as I mentioned to you before. What Junubin want now is unity and a figure that can unite them. And Riek Machar
he still has, you said all, but still has people clearly. And let's get back to the issue with dialogue. You see the dialogue, Kiir announced himself, he declared himself the patron when he was instituting the dialogue. He is the patron of the dialogue, which means the resolutions are going to be submitted to him and so on. and per the decree he issued. And so he went further to declare the government, which was heading at the time as a stakeholder in the dialogue. Then they forgot to mention who are the other stakeholders. There was the decree never mentioned, even his speeches about the dialogue never mentioned who are the rest of the stakeholders. And they went further now to say that the resolutions of the dialogue, once accepted, will be binding on all people, on all the stakeholders. Yet, forgetting that they never mentioned who are the other stakeholders. So it became like a government thing within them, within themselves. The government at the time, which was headed by Kiir and then deputized by Tabandeng. So, with regards to the rest of the parties that were not part of the government, that were not part of the dialogue, do you see fairness here that they are to be bound by the resolutions of that dialogue? Recognizing that most certainly their supporters even didn't express themselves in that dialogue, then is that even national dialogue in the first place if other significant parties have not have their supporters expressing themselves in the process?
I understand that there are legitimate issues to be raised with the national dialogue, and people are free to raise that. My point is anything that is positive, anything that is contributing something positive to help people of South Sudan address the fundamental challenges should be welcome. And the resolution of the national dialogue, all of them are really good. There is really no element within those resolutions that one would want to throw away. These resolutions are very good, and it's particularly the resolution relating to Kiir's and Machar exit. This is what the people of South Sudan are saying. These are people that have blood in their hand. I will be very shocked if they are not indicted by the hybrid court on South Sudan. But these are the people with blood in their hands, and I'm very happy that the people of South Sudan call a spade and said that these people should go. And I think in the end, the resolution will find other ways in which they will be implemented through the permanent constitutional making process. And I don't think because we have done this dialogue that this should be the end of it. I think it's a beginning of so many other dialogues that will come. And in the other experiences of other countries, you do these dialogues all the time. It's not just only a one-time thing that is done and is finished. And there will be more opportunities for people that did not contribute to contribute. I personally did not contribute because when the national dialogue happened, I was in prison. So my voice was not heard. But at the same time, I recognized that these were also views of other fellow South Sudanese, and I should respect them even though I did not contribute personally in those discussions. So those resolutions, they should be embraced, but the people of South Sudan will continue to shape them, and there will be other ways in which they can add their voices to those resolutions.
Elections next year, in case it is going to happen, what position do you intend to contest, or you're not contesting, or you've decided to contest? You tell us, tell our audience what Peter Biar will be looking for in that election.
No, you see, at this time, it's really not an issue for me. It's not really about me contesting, and it's not about me having a position in the government. If that was my interest, this regime of Kiir has offered me so many positions, and I refuse to take some of these positions out of my own accord. So it's not really for me a position. For me is to see the kind of South Sudan that we have all been fighting for, and to ensure that our people actually have a voice in deciding who rules them, instead of someone that is imposing themselves on them. So that is really my interest. It's not so much about Peter Biar contesting or Peter Biar wanting a position. There are so many leaders in South Sudan that are really great people, and I hope to see many of them contesting so that people of South Sudan will have a choice. They have a lot of options from which to choose the right kind of people that can take this country forward.
So this is not a confirmation that from your side, you're confirming you're not going to contest, or you will contest, or you have not decided?
Is immaterial, because it really doesn't matter at this time, because the date is not properly set. The Juba regime has not fully accepted. So we have to wait, and my main goal is to make sure that these elections happen. And if they don't happen, that there is a new political paradigm. That I'm going to push very hard, and I'm going to use whatever platform that I have access to push these kind of ideas, and to keep saying that the regime we have in Juba is a legitimate regime that was never elected, is a corrupt regime, is a regime that is committing horrendous human rights violations against the people of South Sudan, and that the world need to withdraw its recognition of this regime should they not organize election. So I'm going to be very keen in seeing the Secretary General report that will come by July 2021. I will be very keen. I will follow that process very keenly. But my ultimate objective is to see that people of South Sudan vote and they elect their own leaders. And a time will come, and I'm really interested also in seeing young people begin to organize and build consensus among themselves so that they participate, because I really believe in them.
Looking at, going back to what we discussed a little bit now about a country that already, a group of people that already had grievances, even if Kiir was not to be there, Machar was not to be there, and the rest were not to be there. There were those grievances we mentioned over years that built and all this. And when you look also into functions of the president in the constitution and functions of the vice president and all those, they don't include those things of resolving those old grievances and nation building and starting institutions and all this. Now the issue of fairness here and lack of coordinated efforts, even including with South Sudanese who are probably in the opposition right now, and those who have maybe picked up arms against the government. In the absence of coordinated efforts to reach a common goal of building South Sudan, because building a country is not something that happens regularly. You start in a country, we came up as a new country, and our circumstances and all this, and limiting the problems to Kiir and Machar, like I asked earlier, is it not being unfair? And don't you think they need to have coordinated efforts, even with those who are outside, to be able to pull the country out of this crisis and transitions and move us towards democracy and transformation?
There is no doubt you will need a coordinated effort, and the challenges are enormous. But to even begin to address these challenges, you need to get rid of Kiir and Machar, because there is no way you can even begin to address the fundamental problem of the country and focus on nation building and state building with these two hanging there, breathing their toxic air into everything that South Sudanese people are doing. So you need to first of all get rid of them, and then now that can give you the environment where a conducive environment, a fresh air, where you can actually begin to unify the people of South Sudan, which is impossible with them present. You know, just them being in the room create a toxic atmosphere that only remind people of the terrible thing that they have done.
So you said about that the support they command, the supporters they have, they just, despite that, we just get rid of them.
The supporters are a very, very small minority. You know, they pretend that they have a lot of people that is supporting them. That is not true. Where are their supporters? You know, they only have people that they are part of patronage network, individuals that are benefiting from the suffering, people that are afraid, that are terrorized by fear. You know, when you are terrorized, you become so confused that you don't even know who you are for and who you are against, what are your values, what are your interests. You don't know them. So, but if we look at the reality, the South Sudanese you see in South Sudan, do you see them as supporters of Salva Kiir and Riek Machar? What are they supporting? You have an army that has not been paid for months. You have a population that literally is starving. You have 3 million as IDPs and refugees in foreign countries. You have hundreds of thousands in the UN POCs. You have a rural population that is walking with guns, shooting each other and raiding cattle. These people are not supporters. These are people that are hostage. So those they claim to be their supporters are actually their hostages. So instead of talking about Salva Kiir and Riek Machar having supporters, you should talk about them having hostages, because they are good at taking hostage.
You accepted that there is need for coordinated efforts. In that coordinated efforts, you think the two should not be part of it. They can't be part of the solution, because coordinated efforts would mean also everybody being part of the solution.
You know, there is a saying sometimes when you want to help and you want to assist something that you care about, the best thing that you can do is just, you know, to keep your distance and to be absent. So if these people are actually nationalists and they believe that South Sudan should move forward and South Sudan should prosper, the best thing they can do is to exit, you know, because everybody is just tired of that. Even the hostages, those they claim to be the supporters, which I really believe are hostages, deep down in their heart, they are tired of them.
And examples of good leaders that South Sudanese love or South Sudanese want to lead them, in your opinion, who are the good leaders?
No, we don't need to talk about individual. I think once we allow for election to happen, it will be very clear. You know, South Sudanese are very wise people. It will be very clear to them who speak to them, who speak to their needs, who speak to their hopes and their aspirations. And they will make the decision. It's not for me as Peter Biar to appoint who is going to take people forward. But it's up to me to point out who is holding them back. And who is holding them back is Salva Kiir and Riek Machar.
Well, Dr. Peter Biar, in 3 minutes or less, give us your final thoughts on the state of affairs in South Sudan, the way forward also.
I really want the people of South Sudan to understand that when I call for elections, this is really the only option left for us to take care of our situation, take care of our country, and determine the future that we want. Salva Kiir and Riek Machar have a choice to make. Either they organize elections, so they make the tough decision, they unify the militias into a national army, they do the census, they promulgate a new constitution and people vote, or if they continue to drag their feet and create the toxic environment which they have created for so long, then the world will find a way to help South Sudan move past them. So it's important that people of South Sudan are part of this conversation. They make their aspirations known to the world and to their leaders. And I want the people of South Sudan to remember their journey. This journey has never been easy. During the time of the war, the sacrifice we made were enormous. And I know the situation in the country seemed desperate. And people wonder sometimes, why bother? Why even try to do something when nothing is going to change? I assure you, my people, something will change. And you have shown time and again, when you are united, when you are focused, you change things. And I believe this time we are going to change our country, and we are going to begin building that kind of country that we dreamt of when we went to the bush and opposed the tyranny, the crimes, the human rights violations, and corruption of the Arabs regime.
Well, with that, our dear viewer, we've come to the end of the program, the weekly review making sense of relevant topics and news. We had Dr. Peter Biar, South Sudanese civil society leader. He is also a Reagan Fassel Democracy Fellow, National Endowment for Democracy. Thank you very much, Dr. Peter Biar.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
And from me, Roger Alfred Yoron Modi, the producer and the host. See you next week.